She's really good.
And so we'll now move to the second day, last half of the hearing. So I welcome all attendees, all witnesses. And could you please, starting from my left to my right, could you please state your full name, your position, and also whether you wish to take an oath or an affirmation? Yes, please. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Justine Curatolo. I'm representing Heritage Brumby Advocates Australia, and I'm going to take an affirmation.
Okay, you can take the affirmation now.
So I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Miss Barber?
Yep, Debbie Barber, President of Hunter Horsehaven Inc. and also Australian Equine Unification Scheme. Affirmation.
Could you just put the microphone a little bit closer to you, the long one, thank you.
The long one.
That's it, thanks very much.
Yeah, don't touch the little ones, the hand-side people
Oh,
jump
I
over
do.
tables too much. You don't
Affirmation. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Anderson?
Yes, Dennis Anderson. I'm the President of the Coalition for the Protection of Greyhounds, and I'll be taking the affirmation.
Please do.
I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Now, would any of you like to make an opening statement, a short opening statement?
Yes.
All of you?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, we might start from our left. Curatolo?
Curatolo.
Curatolo, okay.
Oh, it's missing an R. It's actually spelled incorrectly. C-U-R.
Points off for the
that's it.
Secretariat. Curatolo.
Did you see?
Beautiful name.
So momentarily, there's an error.
There's-
Hand-side people straight at you.
Well, I'm grateful for that because I want to be recorded accurately, so excellent.
You'll be fine. They're very good.
We're all ears.
The Hansard also have people also have a copy of my opening statement. I've got copies for everyone as well. So I don't know if you'd like me to give you a copy before I read or afterwards.
Just after you read's fine.
Okay, sure. So the Australian Brumby is an iconic part of Australian culture. The stories of the Silver Brumby and the Man from Snowy River inspire people from all generations and backgrounds and bring about their love of the Australian bush and its inhabitants. The Brumby is also known as a wild horse, and as such there is much scientific evidence to prove the benefits of the wild horse, which is a large herbivore, to their ecosystem. In particular, how wild horses can help the environment regenerate after catastrophic environmental disasters. Heritage Brumby Advocates Australia is a legally recognised association formed in response to concerns about irresponsible and inhumane treatment towards a heritage Brumby in Australia. HBAA, otherwise known as HBAA, is an independent organisation with a focus on advocacy and systemic change. We work with all stakeholders and not aligned to any political party. The focus of this inquiry is to report on the effectiveness of arrangements for the administration and enforcement of the laws of New South Wales for the protection of animals from animal cruelty. It is the position of HBAA Inc. that wild horses in Australia are not afforded the same legal protection as their domestic counterparts. Whilst in New South Wales there is some legal protection under the Wild Horse Heritage Bill, which explicitly prevents aerial culling, it does not offer legal protection against animal cruelty. Wild horses are classified as pests by the authorities who are entrusted to comply with prevention of cruelty to animal protection. However, the legal loophole in New South Wales and Australia-wide is that somehow, depending on an animal's legal classification, which is a social construct based on human values and prejudices, that an animal is therefore deemed as not worthy of protection from animal cruelty. The iconic Australian heritage Brumby unfortunately falls into this category, as they are classified as a pest and therefore undeserving of protection from cruelty. It is the position of HBAA Inc. that this situation is unjust and inherently wrong. The New South Wales Government has carried out an ongoing state-sanctioned and funded campaign of intentional misinformation to justify acts of cruelty to wild horses. The RSPCA and other protection agencies have been complicit in this campaign to deliberate cruelty. A recent survey conducted by the Australian Alps National Park, which is a government-funded organisation, assert that the Brumby numbers have grown from 9,187 to 25,318 in 5 years. However, the total number of horses actually counted was only 1,736. In other words, this independent study, in quotation marks, which was paid for and managed by the government, includes an imaginary 23,582 wild horses. On the 21st of December in 2018, the Australian Defence Force reported that they have completed feral horse population control measures at the Singleton Military Training Area. These measures were carried out by a fast accredited team professionally, swiftly and accurately. The RSPCA had approved this measure and were also present at the time of the shooting. Despite our attempts, as well as freedom of information requests, it has been unclear if RSPCA were present the entire time of the shooting, where they were positioned and what alternative measures they engaged prior to approving an aerial cull. It is the position of HBAA Inc. that aerial shooting of wild horses is cruel and inhumane. And finally, as a charity and not a legislated agency of the government with indemnity, the RSPCA is vulnerable to losses at court, which ultimately impacts their financial position. Consequently, this undermines the RSPCA's ability and willingness to prosecute for fear of failure and the costs involved. In 2018-19, the RSPCA New South Wales received 15,673 reports of animal cruelty, yet only 77 prosecutions were commenced. That's a prosecution rate of less than 1%, which is completely unacceptable. It is the position of HBAA Inc. that an independent Office of Animal Welfare should be established and should sit within the Attorney General's Department. Thank you for this opportunity to present today.
Thank you very much. And Ms. Barber?
Okay. My name is Debbie Barber, and I'd like to thank you, the Senate committee, for the opportunity to present here today on such an important issue. I'm sure many of you viewed the recent ABC 7:30 report on the cruelty inflicted on horses prior and during slaughter. I'm here today to inform and show you that the cruelty shown by the ABC is the reality of the Australian horse industry and continues to this day in an industry largely unenforced. I am both the president of Hunter Horse Haven Inc., a charity who currently has 35 horses in rehab, most of which have been rescued from neglect properties or intercepted on their way to slaughter. And over 80% of horses we receive are emaciated on arrival. Over 90% require several months of hoof rehabilitation. I'm also the president of Australian Equine Unification Scheme. We lobby for positive change in the Australian horse industry and have for years. Our organisation collates evidence on horse abuse, cruelty, neglect and breaches of industry standards and acts. The evidence is then supplied to the appropriate agencies mandated to enforce the related welfare acts. We are out in the field all the time assessing sale yards for welfare breaches and constantly reporting breaches of welfare at Australian horse sale yards and transport. We're also constantly involved in neglect cases where horses are starving on properties. We collate statements and pictorial evidence and continuously battle to force any action by RSPCA and other agencies. We have found the best approach is to request a job number during our phone report and provide the collated information only to the RSPCA area manager and request the report, and all evidence is tabled at the next New South Wales RSPCA board meeting. Also emailed to their head office. All these requests don't ensure a positive response. I've just supplied a document, 3 copies. Yep. If you could just have a look at page 10. This is an example of what we deal with every single week. This is what we report to RSPCA, DPI, local lands and agriculture every single week. The person on this property has been under RSPCA monitoring for over 10 years. 12 dogs were removed from her, but she's still breeding dogs and she's still breeding horses. So 10 years of continual monitoring, and the abuse still continues from this hoarder. So when you look at 0.5% of cruelty complaints to New South Wales RSPCA are prosecuted, we have a massive welfare problem in Australia. As in funding was brought up earlier while I was sitting here listening. There's various options for funding. Australia has 2 abattoirs that slaughter horses for human consumption throughout Europe. There's a $5 levy per head per horse. $2.50 of this levy is utilised for the testing of meat prior to export for human consumption overseas. Why aren't the abattoirs paying this levy on testing the meat? And where does the other $2.50 go per horse? We haven't found it. It goes to the government. We don't know where. There is also a point of consumption tax. Does anyone know about the POC tax? which is the percentage of wagering funds implemented by every state apart from Northern Territory between 2017 and 2019. So the estimated revenue, New South Wales 10%, expected annual revenue 100 million. New South Wales Racing received 2% of that. No other agency does in regards to horse welfare. Queensland 15%, 90 million. Victoria 8%, 150 million. WA 15%, not found the annual revenue. South Australia 15%, 24 million to South Australian Racing over 5 years. No percentage to horse welfare. So we have options. As far as we're concerned, it has to be an independent body to prosecute. We are failing animals all over Australia at the moment. It would have to be in regards to have police presence and the Attorney General's Department who have the legal independence and experience to enforce prosecutions, and there is no conflict of interest. Cruelty is systemic in the Australian horse industry and continues unabated without intervention from any agencies mandated to enforce POCTA. Neither RSPCA, DPI or Department of Agriculture enforce POCTA adequately to intercept or prevent cruelty in the system. Prevention could include higher prosecution rates, intervention at sale yards and follow-up on owners of emaciated horses dumped at sales. No agency is willing to adequately enforce animal welfare at sale yards during transport. Education. To educate owners, you need to know where they are.
Barbara, excuse me, is that your last page?
It is,
Great.
yep.
Okay, thanks.
At this time, dogs, cats, goats, sheep, cattle, camels are required to be registered, and we are currently working very hard on implementing a national horse traceability database. Yet if you register a dog in New South Wales, then move to another state, you're required to re-register your dog as there is no central national companion animal database. So unless agencies start liaising and have national databases, we are going to continue to fail the animal welfare in Australia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Barber. Mr. Anderson,
Yes.
would you like to give a brief statement?
Yes, thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank you for giving me the opportunity to appear before this inquiry. And I'd like to start off by just refreshing the members of the inquiry with the objects of the POCTA. The POCTA states that the objects of the Act are to prevent cruelty to an animal by being unreasonably, unnecessarily or unjustifiably killed or inflicted with pain. And I'd like you to keep that in the back of your mind as I read my statement. I'll address, first of all, on-track death and injury. Figures issued by the New South Wales Greyhound Welfare and Integrity Commission show that in the 15 months between the 1st of July 18 and the 30th of September 19, 109 greyhounds died on the track and another 3,245 were injured on the track. So far, this calendar year, up to today, there have been 7 greyhounds killed and 331 injured on New South Wales tracks, and we are only at the middle of February. Greyhound industry spokespeople admit that death and injury on the track are inevitable. In a newspaper article in the Northern Daily Leader on the 6th of December 19, Mr. Jeff Rose, a Regional Director of New South Wales Greyhound Breeders, Owners and Trainers Association and the President of the Gunnedah Greyhound Racing Club, was quoted as saying, quote, "You're never gonna eliminate injuries, the same as you can't eliminate injuries in football." He continued, "I can't see why that is us, the Coalition for the Protection of Greyhounds, are complaining." End of quote. Greyhound Racing New South Wales paid the University of Technology Sydney to investigate how to make tracks safer. The UTS report was given to Greyhound Racing New South Wales in June of 2017. The report found It is strongly recommended that Greyhound Racing New South Wales consider developing purpose-built straight tracks. The UTS further recommended trialling reducing the number of starts per race from 8 to 6. We understand that Greyhound Racing New South Wales conducted a 6-dog trial at Tamworth. We sought a meeting with the CEO of Greyhound Racing New South Wales to discuss these matters. Despite numerous follow-up requests by email and phone, no meeting occurred. 2.5 years after Greyhound Racing New South Wales received the UTS report on how to make tracks safer with specific recommendations, greyhounds are still being killed and injured on oval tracks and at 8-dog races. By any measure, this is a massive failure of preventing cruelty to greyhounds. I would now like to address the off-track deaths.
So it will need to be fairly short because we now have to get on to questioning.
Very short.
So we can tease out all of these
Very short.
elements
Yes.
in more detail. Thank you.
We estimate that in financial year 18-19, 3,560 greyhounds were unaccounted for. The Greyhound Industry Reform Panel reported to the government in February of 2017 and recommended a new greyhound racing register should be established and managed by the Integrity Commission to capture the identity and whereabouts of all greyhounds throughout their life cycle. The government accepted this recommendation. However, the Welfare and Integrity Commission is restricted to tracking only those greyhounds owned by registered racing industry participants, despite this recommendation. More greyhounds are rescued by private rescues, which are dependent on public donation, than by the industry-funded Greyhounds as Pets program. Whole-of-life tracking, monitoring and government-funded rescues and sanctuaries are the only way to ensure that greyhounds do not disappear. The law has failed to protect greyhounds, and the organisations with responsibility to protect them has also failed. The charitable organisations charged with enforcing POCTA are vastly under-resourced to achieve the objects of the Act in respect to greyhounds. Why are organisations which are dependent on public donation enforcing New South Wales legislation? The CPG wants the government to either establish an independent Office of Animal Welfare to oversee, monitor, investigate and prosecute offences against the POCTA, or if that is not possible, the government must fully fund the approved charitable organisations to undertake these functions. We've got 5 demands that we are making. We want to see an implementation of whole-of-life tracking and monitoring. We want to see government funding of rescues and sanctuaries, with the government recouping this money from the gambling industry. We want to see increased penalties for breaches of the POCTA. We want to see reduced breeding, and we want tracks to be made safer. And finally, Mr. Chair, I don't know if any members of the inquiry have a pet dog, but if you did, or if you do, would you like your pet dog to be literally running for its life?
Thank you very much. I might commence the questions from Mr. Anderson. So, when the commitment occurred after the bill was overturned, that was going to ban greyhound racing, so the Integrity Commission was established, and there was a commitment to whole-of-life tracking, so to speak. Yet your evidence is that this is not happening. Can you explain why it isn't?
Yes, I can. And the reason it's not happening is because of the Greyhound Racing Act of 2017. That Act restricts the Greyhound Welfare and Integrity Commission to looking after only those greyhounds that are owned by registered industry participants. So if a registered industry participant passes their greyhound off to someone else, GWIC have no authority to track that dog.
So they could kill the dog, which would be their right, to kill the dog humanely, and we would never know.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you very much. Any questions?
Yeah.
Ms. Abigail Boyd?
Thank you. Thank you for coming and giving your evidence today. There's a few things I'd like to pick up on from the opening statements that were given. I guess firstly, this idea that organisations that are predominantly funded by donations from the public are perhaps constrained not only in terms of their secure funding for the future, but also in how they exercise their powers. Do you think that there is, particularly in horse racing and greyhound racing, where there are different views in the community, that there's some reticence from the RSPCA and AWL in enforcing POTCA because they're worried about upsetting certain donors?
Can I start with that, if that's okay? So do I need to introduce myself when I talk each time? No, it's okay. So I've met with the RSPCA twice in regards to horses, and they're quite clear that they do not want to prosecute unless it's a winnable case. They are really open. In the conversations I've had with them, they've been really explicit in their unwillingness to prosecute unless it's a case that they're likely to win. It is a regular position that they take because prosecution is incredibly expensive. It takes a really long time and they might not get the outcome that they want, which means that they've spent a massive amount of their limited financial resources to not get that money back. And that money does affect their bottom line.
So if the authority that undertakes investigation and prosecution didn't have that resource difficulty, is your view that they're more likely to take on a case which is of public interest,
Yes.
but is risky, but still of public interest?
Yes. So when you compare models in terms of animal welfare and child welfare, when you look at states where they've got child protection models, the prosecution is not an issue for them. If it fits the criteria, they will prosecute because they've got indemnity through a legislated body. The RSPCA does not have that. It does affect their bottom line. It happened in Victoria when they lost the case that they thought they were going to win, and that had a huge impact on their bottom line and the rescue and rehabilitation they could do in the following year. They've said that in their annual report as well. So
they're reluctant to take on anything that's not really very certain because
Yes.
otherwise it could ruin them or make a big dent in
the conversations I've had, they've been really explicit about that, and that sort of information is reasonably publicly available as well, and I think it's clearly reflected in their prosecutorial rates, which is less than 1%.
Could I ask Ms. Barber, yesterday, just following on from the question I asked a moment ago, but yesterday we heard evidence in relation to the whipping of racehorses and the evidence of that being available on, live footage, and yet no action ever being taken against that sort of behaviour by the RSPCA or AWL.
No, there isn't.
What's your take on why that is?
Well, it's exactly what Justine says. We attend sale yards. We go to just about every horse sale auction that we can go to. Today, there is one on, so we've got other people there. And basically, that is what you view at the end of the day. Doggers whipping horses onto trucks. There is no enforcement by any agency of any humane welfare at sale yards. We have requested 100 times, RSPCA, DPI. Justine is part of AEUS, and we have that many reports, like an example of what you've been given, and cases where there is no agency that will come in and help these animals.
Thank you.
So things will have to change. We need to separate RSPCA from the legalities and prosecutions. Otherwise, nothing's going to change and our animals are just going to continue to suffer.
One more question before I hand over to someone else. I think perhaps you, Mr. Anderson, might be best to answer this. Listening to you reading out the objects of the POTCA Act, it does appear that POTCA is really prevention of cruelty to some animals in terms of its implementation, as opposed to it being all animals. So we have a standard that's been put into legislation, and yes, it's 40 odd years old, and we need to update that legislation. That cruelty to animals is unacceptable to the community, and yet we see in instances of industry, whether it's agricultural industry or the gambling industry when it comes to greyhounds and racehorses, a sort of exception or exclusion in terms of what is acceptable as being okay in those circumstances. Is that how you would see the way that it's played out?
Yes, absolutely, because if you look at the objects of the Act, which state that it is an offence to unnecessarily inflict pain on an animal, every greyhound race has the potential to inflict pain or death on an animal, and yet the greyhound races are permitted to operate.
So just following on from that, would you say that inflicting this pain on an animal is necessary in a greyhound race?
It would depend. No, inflicting pain on an animal is never necessary.
And because this is entertainment, I mean, there would be some argument maybe in moving animals in a situation like at an abattoir or other circumstances. They might have to inflict an electric shock or whatever, and that would be argued as being necessary at the time. But is there any necessary time in greyhound racing that pain being inflicted is necessary?
It's our view that in 2020, the public do not accept that the infliction of pain and death on animals for entertainment is acceptable in any way.
Can I add further comment as well, if that's okay? So if you're talking about in terms of what you talked about, POFTA, in terms of, is there exceptions? Of course there is. So if you've got one, you can't cut tails of a pig or anything like that. You can't confine its spaces. So if it's on that side of a fence in a domestic property, you can't do it. But if it's born on the other side of the fence in factory farming, you can. So yes, there are exceptions which allow animal cruelty. So, as long as you're a business making money, you can do what you like, and it's not enforced.
Sorry, just one further thing. In relation to your comment about, you read out a quote saying that injuries are going to happen on greyhound racetracks, just like it would, they would for someone playing a sport. What happens to a dog that is injured, though?
Okay, that will depend on the severity of the injury. Now, some dogs will be injured and they'll have what's called an incapacitation period awarded by the on-track vet. Now, that can vary from a few days up to 3 or 4 months. Now, if the dog has a minor injury, then the chances are that the connections of the dog will take that dog, allow it time to heal the injury, and then they'll put it back into racing. Mm-hmm. A lot of times with the dog, if it's a long period and the connections are losing money, that dog will never race again. Now, the problem then becomes finding out what happened to that dog. Now, under the current regulations, a person who is an owner of a greyhound can transfer that dog from the racing register to the companion animals register. Now, if that person remains as the owner of the dog, and that person being a registered industry participant, the Welfare and Integrity Commission have the right to go and check on the welfare of that dog. If that dog is transferred to the companion animals register and transferred to a person who is not a registered industry participant, there is no further welfare checking done on that dog.
So you could transfer it to a partner or a child, or
that's right, and it could be put down the next day.
Mr.
The other thing,
sorry, we just need to keep moving with questions. Do you have one more comment?
One more point, and that is the current rehoming policy. So once again, if a greyhound is injured and it's no longer going to be profitable to the industry, because the industry is all about profit before welfare. The owner of that dog, an industry participant, who wants to get rid of that dog, apart from transferring it to a friend who will then have it euthanased, under the current policy, he needs to take it to Greyhounds as Pets, which is the industry-funded rehoming organisation. If Greyhounds as Pets reject the dog for any reason, they then need to take it to a private rehomer. If the private rehomer rejects the dog, and 9 times out of 10 the reason they will reject the dog is because they are already full with other greyhounds, once the private rehomer has rejected the dog, you take it back to GAP. If GAP rejects it a second time, you take it to the vet, and it's a one-way trip to the vet.
Okay. Mr. Banasiak.
Just Mr. Anderson, touching on some of your comments in your opening statement, are you aware of any straight tracks in development in terms of the government honouring that commitment to fund and build those straight tracks? Are you aware of any that have commenced or? Was
the Greyhound Racing New South Wales made a statement last year that there was going to be an imminent statement on the development of a straight track.
So they made a statement about making a statement?
That's correct. I contacted Greyhound Racing New South Wales about that, and they confirmed that there was not going to be, despite the newspaper report, any statement about straight tracks. There are no straight tracks in New South Wales. There are 3 operating in Australia, 1 in Queensland, 1 in Victoria and 1 in South Australia. We in the Coalition have done a detailed study of those 3 straight tracks and compared a similar number of races on those straight tracks with a similar number of races on oval tracks in those 3 states, and we can prove that racing on straight tracks reduces, not eliminates, death and injury.
I think a lot of people would agree with you, but I get the sense from your opening statement that a lot of your frustration about the greyhound industry is centred around the fact that the government hasn't held up their end of the bargain in terms of, I guess, making your concerns alleviated in terms of the straight tracks, and I guess the government's not upholding their end of the bargain in terms of the Prc Tax when it comes to greyhounds. Is that a fair assumption from your opening statement, that a lot of your frustration is at the government's lack of action?
Yes.
Ms. Curatollo, I agree with your comments about the study done in terms of the Brumbies. And I guess it's not an isolated issue where studies are done on animals that are based on, I guess, false methodology. If we could actually get an accurate study done on Brumbies and it was shown to be, I guess, a high number that needed to be managed or culled, I know you've stated that your association's opposed to aerial shooting for obvious reasons, and I would agree with you, but what is your position on other culling methodology? Just for clarity of where your association sits.
I support removal and a rehoming. I support humane population management. I just don't support aerial culling. I think that there's...
By humane population management, flesh that out. What do you define that
At the moment, there's a number of organisations, Victorian Brumby Association and also Guy Fawkes Heritage Association, Brumby Heritage Association. They do successful trapping and rehoming programs. Guy Fawkes pass through a lot of numbers, and so do VBA. If the statistics and the population data was accurate, then, majority of Brumby supporters do support removal. We do want humane population management. It's not in anyone's interest if Brumbies' population exceeds what they can naturally sustain. I don't support aerial culling. There's enough evidence to suggest that aerial culling is inhumane, but I do support removal and rehoming.
So do you support ground shooting as opposed to aerial culling?
We just need to be coming back to the terms of reference. Thanks.
There's one line that says "and related matters." This is related.
So I'm trying to get clarity on their position in terms of animal welfare and how you manage a particular species in line with the Act.
I think in terms of methods, I would say ground shooting is more humane than aerial shooting, but I'm not actually supporting ground shooting.
I didn't expect you to advocate for that.
But I'm just saying, in terms of evidence, it does seem that ground shooting is more humane.
Can I add to that?
By all means.
They are trialling birth control in 30 parks in America, an implant that they can actually shoot into the horse. If this was a method that Australia adopted, we wouldn't be aerial culling.
And so is your question related to this issue, Ms Hurst, or is
Not on aerial
Okay.
culling, but I have
Come back to you.
questions.
Mr Secor,
Can I just jump in with another aerial question?
related to this
So,
subject?
in regard to animal welfare, what is your response to the Environment Minister who on January 22nd said that they were going to, quote, engage in the best ever pest control campaign in the Snowy Mountains in regard to the Brumbies?
I think my response is that the information that they've received and how they've come up with that response has been through the influence of single interest groups who have political agendas to pursue, and I don't think the information that they've received has been well balanced, and it doesn't truly represent the contribution that wild horses can make.
The Invasive Species Council in December 2019 said there were 15,000 Brumbies there,
Yep.
and they said that they're actually moving in to the parts that are not burnt. So they're pushing other animals out.
So did invasive species councils provide evidence of that?
No, the last part was my comment to that. The 15,000 was the invasive species
And
council.
so the invasive species councils, in terms of that number, referring to that study which I've made reference to, in which they cited 1,600 horses, and then they've, through this formula, have extrapolated it to 25,000. So if you were to the people who ran that study is actually, they claim it as independent, but it's actually funded through the government, and that's really clearly labelled on the website. So if there was an independent study done to, for the population numbers, then I'm happy to come back to the table and
I don't know if the
discuss.
RSPCA has a role in this, quote, the best ever pest control campaign. Do you know?
From what I'm aware, that this is a government initiative through the Department of Environment. So in Victoria on the weekend, there's some conflict as well. Just recently, there's conflict between Department of Environment and also the parks bodies, and whether they're talking to each other and being consistent in their approaches.
Can we move on to Ms Hurst?
I've actually got a follow-up question just also from what Mr Secord was asking. Are you suggesting that the counting methodology is flawed?
I'm suggesting that the methodology used is not accurate, and there's enough data on their websites to prove that. What they saw in reality was 1,687 horses, and what they've used to extrapolate that information has come up to 25,000.
Okay.
Is that extrapolation called the correctional factor?
It's just the formula that they've used. They've explained it on their website as its formula.
But it ignores all, I guess, knowledge that you have about a particular species and how they move and their home range and everything like that. So it's flawed from the onset, just
Yes.
because they don't acknowledge
That's right.
the individuality of a species.
Yes.
I'll just, thank you. Thank you, Chair. Mr Anderson, do you support greyhound in the greyhound industry, or do you feel that they should be responsible or partly responsible for funding the prosecution arm of the RSPCA and the Animal Welfare League?
The greyhound racing industry, and I include in that the gambling industry, because as McHugh identified, without gambling there would be no greyhound racing industry. They should be responsible for all aspects of greyhound welfare from birth to death. So whether it is housing the greyhounds, ensuring their welfare, following up with investigations and, if necessary, prosecutions, should all be funded by the greyhound racing industry and the gambling industry.
Do you feel that that might potentially create a conflict of interest if a private charity is receiving a huge amount of their funding from the same organisation that then they're required to prosecute? You don't think that?
Now, what we've said in our submission is that a lot of greyhound welfare organisations will not accept money from the industry because they consider it to be tainted by cruelty and criminality. So what we are putting forward is that the government should be funding this, and that the government, through the Betting Tax Act of 2001, recoup that money 100% from the greyhound racing industry, so that the people who are involved in greyhound welfare are actually at arm's length from the money.
Another thing that we've spoken about quite a bit at this inquiry, and this is for everybody here, is the idea of a creation of an independent Office of Animal Welfare. And I just wanted to get the thoughts of your organisations as to how that would work and if you would support that kind of a system.
Look, we're not sure how that would work. What we have as a philosophy is that legislation and laws, the investigation and prosecution of acts against legislation and laws should be the responsibility of the government, not donors to private charities. So whether it be a government body, such as an independent Commission for Animal Welfare, or whether the approved charity organisations separate their investigations and prosecutions away from their education and shelter functions, so that there is transparency that the government could fully fund the investigation and prosecution arms of the approved charity organisations.
Can I ask the same question?
Yes, so we fully support Independent Office of Animal Welfare. As I've mentioned, I think the charity is unable to effectively prosecute. In New York, they have a separation of powers already, and it works quite well. So the model I would see it would be to work similar to child welfare. So you have a government body. For me, I see the department, I see that sitting within the Attorney General's department. And they would be responsible for prosecution, and hopefully there would be money available to the charity, if that's what it is, to do the rescue, rehoming and education and the preventative work.
Mr. Veach.
Thank you for your attendance today and your submissions. So first of all, the terms of reference talks about whether or not there is a requirement for a review of the animal welfare legislative framework in New South Wales, because there's more than one act, more than just POCTA, there are other acts as well. So individually, one, do you support that overarching review and an attempt to modernise, contemporise the animal welfare legislative framework in New South Wales? And two, why do you support or not support that? And I guess we'll start with Ms. Curatolo.
Okay. Yes, I do completely support an absolute overhaul. I think there's way too many exceptions within POCTA, which allows animal cruelty to occur, and I find that hugely concerning. And you also find that there's state to state, some things are a little bit different, but also state-based POCTA legislation doesn't tie in with federal legislation, and it leaves a lot of loopholes. There's also changes in definitions and things like that. So I strongly support POCTA being overhauled and become more current, like you said, in terms of technology. You know, that we need to be more accountable in terms of microchipping and scanners available and all that kind of stuff. And what was the second part? Do I support an overhaul? And
So you just answered, yes you do, and why. So,
oh, okay, great,
Yep,
thank
yep.
you.
Yes, there's so many acts, standards, guidelines in regards to every single section. I mean, predominantly we're horses. So if you look, for example, knackeries, you've got probably 8 or 10 agencies involved that are supposed to come under POCTA, and they are supposed to be regulated by RSPCA, but that doesn't happen. So to sort of go forward, yes, we need to separate them from prosecutions. And what was your second question?
So do you support the idea of a review?
Yes, most definitely. We need.
Why? You just explained why, yes.
Yes, we do. And just to bring one point up, when it comes to horses, we've spoken about greyhound racing. At the end of the life of a horse when it races, it is not traceable. And we also have the added problem that horses are categorised as under two categories. They're both companion, if they're at pony club or dressage, and then if they're on a transport vehicle or at a sale yard or slaughter their livestock. So they fall under all that. So they have not been categorised in any state in any form, and that's something that has to be looked at as well.
Thank you. Mr. Anderson, do you support the overarching review of the legislation, and why?
Yes, we do support an overarching review. There are 3 acts that pertain to greyhounds: the POCTA, the Greyhound Racing Act of 2017, and the Companion Animals Act. And there are loopholes in all of those acts whereby people can commit acts of cruelty on greyhounds and get away with it.
Okay. My second question relates to accessing information, so public information. Now, I gather each of your different organisations would have at some stage lodged a request for information under the Government Information Public Access Act, the GIPA Act. Varying degrees of success, maybe, but first of all, have you actually tried to access information through GIPA?
We did it through Freedom of Information before it changed, so...
Okay, yep. But essentially you have?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, well, actually, we worked together.
Okay.
So, yes, we did, and that was on horse slaughter figures from Department of Agriculture, and we never received the figures, only that they couldn't provide them, and the figures actually came out at the Senate inquiry in Canberra on traceability.
Okay.
Yep.
You should know Walt and I are prolific GIPA lodgers, so
Oh, well, we know who will contact you tomorrow.
we have varying degrees of success.
I didn't say they were successful.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, that's right.
And Mr. Anderson?
I bet it's
No, we've never tried to access anything through GIPA, and there are other greyhound welfare organisations that are doing the other work to get freedom of information that we share.
Yep.
But I would like to share a story with you, if I may, about when I tried to contact the Office of Racing. It is impossible to ring the Office of Racing. If you go onto any of the New South Wales government websites, you will not find a phone number for them. I spent an entire morning trying to ring someone in the Office of Racing, and it ended up with me talking to a lady who was on the New South Wales government switchboard, who was talking to somebody in the Office of Racing. She said to me that the person in the Office of Racing had told her that she was not to give me anyone's name or telephone number in the Office of Racing.
Yeah. We have some government members here. I'm certain will be pleased to act upon that
Come on,
for
defend
you.
Matt Keane. Come on, defend
So now, on my last line of questioning
You got the number?
for this relates to education. Now, a number of the witnesses I spoke about, they're surprised by the low amount of money that's paid to the, or not paid to, that is provided to the agencies such as RSPCA and AWL via the block grant funding arrangements. So it's a low amount. But also, is there a need for additional funding just for education for the community? So a broad education program around what is animal welfare and animal welfare expectations in this state. Very short, do you think there should be an education program funded by government to do that? And if so, what would it look like? I'll start with Mr. Anderson this time.
Now, are we talking about an education program for industry participants or for the public as a whole?
This is a public as a whole around what is animal welfare expectations in this state.
Yes, absolutely, we should be.
Yes.
I-
It is required. I don't know how you would actually achieve it, but yes.
I think there is already some pretty good animal education flyers and leaflets and stuff around that you can get from the website and you can download, especially in terms of drought and stuff. The issue is that people who are going to comply are going to comply. It's the people who aren't. So the focus, I think, there needs to be more on enforcement.
Yep. Okay. Oh, sorry, and if I could just quickly, one last question. I've asked this to everyone, so it's only fair. Yesterday I posed to some witnesses, if regardless of whatever the review of the legislation comes up with, and regardless of whether they decide upon an independent office of animal welfare or an advocate, or whether the funding stays with the ACOs, the RSPCA and AWL, do you see there a need for this type of arrangement once or twice a year where the agencies that are legislatively required to undertake compliance and prosecution in animal welfare space would actually have to come and sit in front of parliamentary inquiry and answer questions just like this?
Only if there was enforcement. I mean, if they're just going to come and tell you the same figures each year and nothing changes, there's no point. So there's got to be some sort of power behind it to enforce change.
Yeah, Any agency, whether a charity or a government department trusted to enforce the humane welfare of animals in Australia must be held accountable for their failures.
Yep.
Any agency that is in receipt of public monies should have to front a parliamentary inquiry and explain how they've spent those public monies.
Okay.
Mr Mason Cox?
That would certainly increase the scope for many organisations. But look, can I just ask you,
Gee whiz.
Ms Curatola, in relation to your submission, you recommend an independent office of animal welfare, and I think the basis primarily that you make that recommendation is in relation to the prosecutorial function of the RSPCA and AWL in relation to that not being effective.
Less
and
than
being
1%.
Let me finish. And there being a conflict in relation to their role in education and sort of other sort of roles they have. Now, what do you think of the model? I want to put to you an alternative to that, which is that the actual police force, which is responsible for enforcing crime in this state, actually takes a role in relation to those issues.
I support that.
Okay, so is that a viable alternative in your mind? It's just someone else that needs to.
There needs to be a separation of powers, so
those areas,
whether that's in an independent office of animal welfare or whether the police are able to do that, I support that. I'm really clear there needs to be a separation of powers.
Okay, thank you.
Can I answer something for you? Yeah. Under POCTA 1979, number 200, section 24D, the definition of an inspector includes a police officer. So a police officer has the powers that RSPC have in regards to animal welfare.
I'm familiar with that. I'm talking about the actual role of prosecuting and enforcing the Act and the crimes under the Act, which is something that the RSPCA can do as well. So I'm asking, if you take it out of the RSPCA,
Take it out of the RSPCA.
where would you put it?
Well, my preference would be to sit within the Attorney General's Department because there's no conflict of interest, but I also strongly support it to sit within the Police Department as well.
We're open to either or.
Of course.
Thank you.
Further questions?
Just one. You raised the fact that the RSPCA don't take on cases that they can't or they don't believe they can win. If we moved it to the police or the DPP, which was a suggestion by somebody else, are we still not faced with the same problem? Because the DPP won't take on cases that they don't believe they can win either. No, because the RSP, it's a bottom dot line for the RSPCA, so they won't take them on if they're going to be a massive financial loss, whereas government departments have indemnity, so they will take on cases as long as they fit the criteria, whereas RSPCA have openly not taken on cases even though they fit the criteria because the cost is going to be too large for them. Okay.
We honestly, we're working on anywhere between 3 and 5 neglect cases a week of a property full of horses. And we can't get RSPCA out, even with reports, with all that information that I've provided.
So I have a question for both you, Ms. Barber, and Ms. Curatola.
Yep.
We'll get it right
Justine.
eventually. The Minister of the day banned the aerial culling of cattle and horses. And is it true that was as a consequence of the aerial culling of horses in Guy Fawkes National Park?
That's correct. But what happened 2018 happened in New South Wales was aerial shooting. It was on federal land, the Singleton Army Defence Base. So it was banned, but they found a loophole because it was on federal land.
I see. And you said that the RSPCA were involved with analysing that. And
Yes.
Did the RSPCA give an okay to go ahead?
Yes. And the Australian Defence Force have included that in their statement. The RSPCA have approved it.
Okay. Has there been any, obviously there was a reason why the Minister implemented a ban on aerial culling of horses and cattle. Were there any reports to reassure your organisation and the community that the horses were humanely and cleanly killed?
Only when we engaged with them and we organised a meeting to go up and meet with them, and they gave us assurance then. So I think they released a very brief media statement, but there was no way for us to verify any of it because obviously all defence personnel were asked to leave the base. Locals weren't allowed to go in and helicopters weren't allowed to fly over. So we weren't able to verify if that was true or not, only based on what they said.
Can I answer something on that?
Sure.
You're trying to shoot an animal running and galloping at approximately 60 kilometres an hour over rough terrain from a helicopter, and you're trying to shoot it in the heart. Who can do that shot? We have found horses 6 and 7 days later on the ground bleeding, still alive, foals with broken legs. It is actually an atrocious and inhumane way to dispose of any animal.
And so, just to come back to what happened in the defence grounds near Singleton, so was there ever any report of an inspection by the RSPCA or any other authority for that matter of the horses after they were shot to assure us, that the animals were killed cleanly?
Through Marine Faruqi, Senator Marine Faruqi, we were able to do a freedom of questions to the minister, so we got some answers that way, but we didn't get, there was no official report released. It was only through the questions from the minister.
Thank you. Any other questions? Nope. Okay. Well, look, thank you very much for your evidence. It's extremely helpful, actually, and we appreciate the time you've taken. Have there been any questions taken on notice? No. So that concludes this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And,
Thank you.